Good evening. My name is John O'Sullivan. I'm the president of the Danube Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here tonight. This is the first of two linked events which are marking the anniversary of the 100th anniversary of the 1917 October Revolution, which, as we now know, took place in November. But this is a particularly important occasion for the Institute because we were founded with the assistance and advice of the man whom we are commemorating tonight. And that is the late Robert Conquest, who died early last year. Robert Conquest I knew well as a friend and was happy to be his friend. If I have a place in history, which is extremely doubtful, it'll be as the man who introduced Robert Conquest to Margaret Thatcher in order for him to write the first draft, in fact the only draft, of the Iron Lady speech that first made her prominent in international relations as opposed to domestic British politics. I was evading the task myself on the very sensible grounds that I didn't know anything about foreign policy, and I should get somebody who did. And since I happened at the time to be sharing an apartment with Robert, he seemed to be the ideal person to suggest. And that was a very important fact, because a very important introduction, because Robert and Margaret Thatcher became very good friends, and she continued to seek and follow, not invariably, but mostly follow his advice in the years that followed in Downing Street and later. Now, we're privileged tonight to have among a number of distinguished guests Mrs. Elizabeth Conquest, Dr. Elizabeth Conquest, who is now, among other things, Bob's literary executor, and to whom he was happily married in an extraordinarily happy marriage for over, I think, 30 years. And I'm happy to say that, as a result of knowing him, Melissa and I became good friends of hers. Now, Robert, of course, is famous particularly for his books on the Soviet Union. And that, of course, will be the focus of tonight's event, which is a lecture by his distinguished friend and fellow academic, Robert Service, who will be delivering the Robert Conquest Memorial Lecture later, in a few minutes, in fact. But the point about Robert's career, among other things, is that in addition to being a distinguished historian of the Soviet Union, he was also a poet, and a very distinguished poet, among his other works, and he wrote novels and light verse and literary criticism of a very high order. But in particular, he was a poet. He received the Silver Medal of the Royal Society of Literature, and his poetry continues to be read and admired and enjoyed. Now, I'm going to ask Lydie Conquest, who's here, if she would be kind enough to come up and read us one of Robert's poems, and also, if I can then, she has another presentation to make before I introduce Professor Service. Lydie.
It's actually rather interesting to be looking out on the church next door, because my husband's first visit to Budapest when he was a student at Oxford in 1938 and was roaming around in a beat-up baker's van that functioned as transportation and hotel, arrived in Budapest on the night of August 19th, 1938, and parked in front of the church next door. In the morning, he and his companion were rudely awakened by frantic pounding on the window, saying, "You must move. An important procession is happening." And it was indeed the procession of the right hand, I think it's called. So they moved. But he did see Budapest then, before the war. And then, after the war, He had served on the 3rd Ukrainian Front, had fought in Bulgaria, and then was here at the end of the war. And having seen the city before, wrote this poem as he stood on the Pest side of the Danube, looking up at the ruins of Buda. He wrote this: Budapest in 1945. Looking through dusk and a very light mist over the luminous gray Danube and the lamps beginning from that hill of broken palaces, the ruins assumed an ageless beauty, hiding the terribly slashed city, one of the very rawest zones in which Europe's hatred went absolutely to the bloody whirlpool's center. Struck a cold thunder, every usual noise and thought, and carved granite to a formless monument. Gold light shivered warmly from the water through the vague evening, for even there, among all that debris of brick, flesh, and steel, the eye selected blindly its focus, and so no verse can ever express the essence of the deadly plague. And the other small gift I have that I would like to give to Zoltán Németh as a representative of the Hungarian Parliament is a book that one of my husband's later books that was first published in English in 1999, called Reflections on a Ravaged Century, which covers the 100 years that we are going to be discussing at the conference tomorrow.
Thank you very much.
While we were beginning the proceedings, another guest arrived, and he, among the distinguished guests, he is the other person I would like to mention here today, and that is János Horváth, who will be known to Hungarians, but not to the foreigners present, perhaps on this case, as the man who was the youngest Hungarian member of the European Parliament elected in 1945, and then Hungarian Parliament. What did I say? Oh yes, Hungarian Parliament. I'm sorry, and who after he lived many years in America, ran for Congress, was a successful academic, became a friend of Ronald Reagan's, had, in other words, the most remarkable kind of life. He returned to serve after 1989 in the Hungarian Parliament, and the second time, and at the last elections here, he finally left the Parliament as its oldest member. In addition to being both the youngest and the oldest member of the Hungarian Parliament, János was also somebody who was slated for execution by both the Nazis and the communists. So it's a somewhat blessing that we have him here, actually, because there were so many ways in which he might not have made it. But thank you for being here. We are, of course, marking an extremely important historical event, an event which, oddly to me at least, is still contested in the sense that there are still admirers of it and admirers of what it achieved, but which most people, I think probably everybody here, would consider one of the bleakest and blackest days in human history, leading to many other ills in the course of the century. That was the meaning, of course, of Bob Conquest's work in history. He, more than most people, most historians of the day, understood what had happened and detailed it with such painstaking scholarship that that it was impossible to deny the crimes of Stalin. And so before Solzhenitsyn arrived in the West with his stories, Robert was somebody who had done the necessary scholarship and written with the necessary eloquence and demonstrated the necessary historical caution to be able to make the definitive case against Stalinism. Now, another historian who could make the same claims, and who was an admirer and a friend of Bob's, and worked on the same kind of themes, but of course that has not a different take, but a take which takes in other things, is our guest tonight, Professor Robert Service, a distinguished scholar who's been at Cambridge University, at Oxford University, at Leningrad University, who is now a senior fellow at St Anthony's College, Oxford, and I think I'm not sure of the title in Stanford, but he is a regular attender at Stanford University, and whose books include not only the Soviet period of Russian history, but far more widely. In fact, his latest book is about the last of the Romanovs. And so we're very privileged to have a view of a great man by a colleague of equal eminence. And so it's with great pleasure that I ask Robert Service to give us the Robert Conquest Memorial Lecture.
Thank you very much for that very gracious introduction. It's a real thrill for me to be here this evening, and also to have heard Liddy read out one of Robert Conquest's very fine poems. He was an extraordinary man because he combined the literary with the historical in an almost seamless way. He was also a notable public figure in British, European, and Western life. I first heard a poem of Robert Conquest when I was 13 years old, when an English master at my secondary school read out the one called Excerpt of a Report to the Galactic Council. It was a sort of rather science fiction type of poem. So I knew him as a poet many, many years before I had any idea that he was making an astonishing contribution to the history of Soviet totalitarianism. The book that made worldwide impact for him was The Great Terror. We all use the term the Great Terror now. Robert Conquest invented it. It was used very sparingly in Russia until the fall of communism. Now it's used generally. Previously, it was referred to as the period of the cult of the individual. Millions of people were killed in the years 1937 to 1938. Millions of people were killed before and after, but especially in that 2-year period of the Great Terror. And the euphemism that was applied to it was the period of the cult of the individual. Robert Conquest tore back the veil of preposterous euphemism and called things by their names. Actually, his poetry is very similar in its drive to use plain words when plain words will do. The Conquest analysis is one with which I overwhelmingly agree. But that book, The Great Terror, was welcomed not only by people who more or less universally accepted the fundamental idea, namely that the USSR had invented a one-party, one ideology, terror-based state, that it had poured people into its gulag labor camps, that it was systematically building up propaganda in favor of militant atheism, that it was dedicating itself to legal nihilism. All of these ideas were absolutely essential to Robert Conquest's oeuvre. But the really quite astonishing thing about the book, The Great Terror, was that it was welcomed by people along the political range, from even Trotskyists through to the middle of the Western political spectrum and out to the further reaches of the political right. He was an open-ended sort of writer, in other words. You could read him and find out what you wanted for yourself. But his essential message was that there was something utterly rotten and wrong about the way that the Soviet model had developed in Russia and was spread not just to one or two countries, but to a third of the world's Earth's surface in the 60 or 70 years after the October Revolution. And it was this insistence then that something had to be done about it that marked his public persona. It was one of the reasons why then he was welcomed for having written The Great Terror, but shunned and disliked by many who couldn't take the rest of his judgment, because the rest of his judgment insisted that something had to be done about communism worldwide, that it wasn't right that Western policy ignored the fate of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and the countries to the west of those Baltic states, including this one, Hungary. He was insistent that only a much firmer Western policy was desirable, endorsable, morally acceptable. And he pursued this all through his public career. And that was why he was a controversial figure. He's no longer very controversial because most of his ideas have actually conquered. Most of his ideas are now part of the conventional wisdom, but they weren't at the time. He had to stand up for them. And he stood up for them in his own particular way. And I know that this is what attracted me to the way that he wrote. Whereas most people who characterized the Soviet Union as a totalitarian state assumed that nothing could happen inside that state, everything had to change from without, from the outside, if change was ever to come, Robert Conquest concentrated on the internal dynamics of dispute and dissension, of difficulties that the leadership often had in imposing its will upon a recalcitrant and passively resistant population. He was interested then not only in the leaders, but in the led, the people who were being pushed into communism. He was interested in communization. And the book that he wrote that was just as important conceptually as The Great Terror was one written 7 years previously, Power and Policy in the USSR, which really laid out in a remarkable way, in a prescient way, the difficulties that the Soviet political leadership had in imposing its will permanently on a people who didn't want to accept all of the doctrines of communism. And I think that leads us to ask questions about what communism really was like. It was a one-party state. It was a state that in most communist countries imposed a single acceptable ideology. It did disseminate a militant version of atheism. It did regard itself as having the right, whenever it wanted, to mobilize its own society, whether the society was agreeable to that or not. And it's an extraordinary thing about communist societies. Absolutely all of them, without exception, also placed travel bans on their peoples, on their people. Each one of them had an idea that communism was so good that it had to be kept within frontiers. So people should not hear from abroad radio signals or TV stations from abroad, and shouldn't travel abroad freely unless they were compliant with the purposes of the communist leadership. And yet, it's still the case that the human spirit survived in all of those countries. In Eastern Europe in particular, in Poland, in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, the human spirit was never totally crushed. Totalitarianism, in other words, was never totally effective. There was something about the human spirit that survived. And the oddest thing of all, I think, about communism is that it was regressive, that it engendered in all the societies that we know about, whether it's Poland or China or Russia or Georgia, in all of these countries it was the same story, that the old medieval, tribal, feudal networks that were being eroded by the process of modernization were halted by communist revolutions, and even communists themselves huddled together in ways to protect themselves against the depredations of the central communist leadership. And for that reason then, older systems of governance started to prevail. In Russia today, it is still the case, in Putin's Russia today, that patronage networks, clientelism, and the like are important features of public life. It's also the case that communist systems, if they last any length of time, tend to alternate between periods of purge and mass violence and accommodation to the recalcitrant society that simply won't put up with communism and will engage in forms of passive resistance, non-compliance, so that there too the traditions of family and friendship groups and literary circles become little oases in which communism is quietly, not violently, resisted. Now, this isn't what I'm trying to say tonight, which I think flows out of a lot of what Robert Conquest wrote, is that this isn't an accident. It's not a fluke that this pre-modern way of organizing society emerged in communist country after communist country, first in the Soviet Union, but then after the war in Eastern Europe. It's actually almost a scientifically detectable consequence of communization. And communism regaled the world with boasts of its successes. Joseph Stalin talked about how much steel production and iron production had increased through his first 5-year plan in 1928 to 1932, which was a 5-year plan completed in only 4 years. In other words, it wasn't very well planned. It was the plan of the whip and the knout, not of scientific planning. And it transpired from all of this that Soviet communism, and this was a model followed elsewhere in the communist world, was adequate in terms of producing armaments and capital goods, but deficient in spreading the benefit of industrial growth to the consumer sectors of society. And in Stalin's time, they got round this to some extent by virtue of the fact that many Western economies were willing, in order to get out of the consequences of the Great Depression, to trade with the Soviet Union. So as Stalin starved his peasants, again, looking at Robert Conquest's great book, Harvest of Sorrow, starved the Ukrainian and southern Russian peasants into submission and sold the grain abroad. He bought, firstly, German technology, and then when Hitler came to power, American technology, in order to industrialize the USSR. After 1945, this was no longer possible because the American Cold War policy changed and embargoes were placed about the transfer of advanced technology that might have a potential military use. That meant that communism had to find ways to develop itself. It could do this very, very inadequately. Years ago, I wrote a book which was a world history of communism, and I scoured the United Kingdom for advice about which consumer good had been invented in a communist country which was then sold to the rest of the world. And I could only come up with one, the Rubik's Cube. It was the most spectacular communist country's consumer product. But that was the only one that I could find, and I spoke to dozens of economists. It was as if I was torturing them, because I would say, could you just tell me one consumer good? I need to finish the chapter. But it was actually in my own children's bedroom, the Rubik's Cube. The alternative to that was systematic industrial espionage. If you couldn't develop it yourself, steal it. But if you stole it, what did you do with it? How did you diffuse it? How did you disseminate it throughout your society? Until very, very recently, no communist society, no communist leadership has managed to pull off that trick. I'll be coming on to China in a few moments. Always, though, despite this appalling record of carnage and oppression and mass terror, purges, there have been fools for communism around the world. There have been, in the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s, people who have stood up and said that the Soviet Union is a sort of model that offers a way out of the problems that Western societies engender. Robert Conquest wrote a remarkable poem published in 1969, two stanzas of which touch on this theme. And it's a poem called George Orwell. And I don't think Robert Conquest was ever a man who drew attention to himself in a vain way. So it wasn't one of those poems that was about himself. But the more I've read the poem, the more I've thought that it actually applied to Robert Conquest. And the two stanzas go as follows. Moral and mental glaciers, melting slightly, betray the influence of his warm intent, because he taught us what the actual meant. The vicious winter grips its prey less tightly. Not all were grateful for his help, one finds, for how they hated him who huddled with the comfort of a quick remedial myth against the Cold War, the cold world, and their colder minds. I think this says a lot about the way that Western minds were often gripped by false ideas about the wonders of Soviet communism. Country after country after the Second World War had communism imposed on them. Some of those countries had tiny, infinitesimally tiny communist parties at the point at which the Red Army entered from the Soviet Union. And then the process of communization began. And then people started to believe that they had to live with communism. And abroad there were people who were applauding what was going on. There were jumbled versions of communism in the generation when I was a student in the late 60s. Hugely jumbled and confused versions of communism involving applause for Trotsky, acclaim for anarchism, enthusiasm for Che Guevara, as if all of these things added up to a coherent picture of the world and a desirable way to a better future. That's all largely in the past now, not totally in the past, but largely in the past. Eurocommunism in the 1970s reared its head, a version of communism that suggested that a path different from the Soviet path, distant from Leninism, was possible in Europe. It died out with the death of Soviet communism. Communism as an idea faded from view. One of the ways that it faded was that the Soviet Union started to reform itself because of its own lack of competitiveness with Western states, militarily and economically. That's often the story that they told us in the late 1980s. What they didn't tell us, which is something I feel strongly about, was that the Western pressure on the Soviet Union began to tell. They'd had 4 or 5 decades of technological embargoes. No amount of industrial espionage could surmount that quarantining of technological inventiveness. Robert Conquest played his part in stiffening the resolve of Western leaders. Western leaders, not just Reagan, but even before that, American presidents in general, including to some extent even Jimmy Carter, placed economic pressure on the Soviet Union so that in a world of two superpowers, it became so obvious that one of them was running and the other was only limping. And Gorbachev got his chance of power partly because he was committed to reform, because he was of the generation of 1956, the Khrushchev generation of the 20th Party Congress, but partly because the rest of the Politburo recognized that they'd tried every other way of dealing with running their country and it wasn't working. So that they gave his head to Gorbachev when he said, if I have a peace policy that works with Ronald Reagan, who you all regard as a warmonger, we will release funds sufficient to be able to reform internally. This proved to be utopian. His ideas didn't work out. But that was the reason that he was given the chance. That was the reason that this magical period of democratization took place so rapidly in the Soviet Union from 1985 onwards. Gorbachev didn't understand the architecture of communism. He didn't understand that without a one-party state, without a one-ideology state, without a degree of political repression, the whole system would start falling apart. If writers could criticize past leaderships, then what was the point of Marxism-Leninism? What was the point of the whole founding ideology of the October Revolution? And so the whole system started to implode as a result of Gorbachev's reforms. But we would be wrong if we thought that firm Western policy didn't play its part in that process. And then a remarkable thing happened, that the Soviet retreat occurred from Africa, from parts of Asia, such as Vietnam, where the USSR was given no chance of doing anything else but retreat if it wanted to have better relations with the People's Republic of China from Eastern Europe in 1989 to 1990. And one of the most extraordinary things then started to have an impact on world policy, which was the rise of one of the few communist states from oblivion, from economic oblivion, into prominence, namely the rise of communist China. Out of a strategic decision by the Nixon White House to use China as a pressure point to be aimed at Moscow, came funds sufficient to help to kick off Chinese industrialization. Communism in China has produced what is at the moment a completely unexpected hybrid. It is a communist society, one of the few communist societies where consumer goods production is a general phenomenon and a generally effective phenomenon, where the diffusion of goods and now the invention of goods is a standard phenomenon. We don't know how brittle this tension between a one-party, politically oppressive state and a wild capitalist power. We don't know what's going to happen. It may be much more brittle than we imagine at the moment. It's the one exception to it's the one great exception to the general picture that I've been presenting. Anti-communism in Russia is headed by Vladimir Putin, himself a former communist and a former KGB officer, a lieutenant colonel in the old KGB, and an ex-director of the FSB. Anti-communism, as expressed by Vladimir Putin, borrows from the toolkit of communism. It borrows many of the techniques of propaganda and political oppression that were used in the 1960s and 1970s in the USSR. But it's different. It's anti-communist in ideology. It's anti-revolutionary because it doesn't want another revolution in Russia for obvious reasons, which is one of the reasons why so little attention was paid to the anniversary in Moscow yesterday. The party matters hardly at all. United Russia is not a massive influence on the politics of modern Russia. But there's still the reduction in scope for real political pluralism, reduction in the scope for democracy and the rule of law. Probably what is loose in the world that is most like communism, as I've been describing, is Islamist jihadism. Islamist jihadism in the Middle East, in Afghanistan and other parts of the world borrows much more of the toolkit, much more of the communist toolkit. The communists invented the one-party, one ideology state, but it's usable by other ideologies, and it's being used by the so-called Islamic State in Iraq and Iran today. Western powers are in a quandary. Western powers are in a profound and deep quandary at the moment. It's not like the 1920s or 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. There is no single great enemy. There is no single great superpower that Western powers have to confront. Moreover, there's no single coherent Western political alliance any longer. There's no definite political understanding shared between the countries from Poland to Spain and then across the Atlantic to Canada and the United States. And one of the dangers of the period in which we are living is even more basic to that. There is no shared idea about fundamental values any longer. Particularly in the last 3 or 4 years, there's been a shattering of the glass of consensus. We live in a much more dangerous world now than we were living in even 5 or 10 years ago. But I know that if Robert Conquest were here this evening, he'd be saying, pull yourselves together. Think about what you need to do. Think about what your basic values are, and try to get together to construct a world that's worth living in for everyone. Thank you.
Whoops. I need to lose weight. First of all, I want to thank you very warmly indeed for that wonderful address, which combined high seriousness with an easygoing style, which meant that we were listening to an after-dinner speech, even though we weren't listening to an after-dinner speech in the conventional sense. It was a wonderful presentation, and we're deeply grateful. Secondly, I have to thank you also because you're going to be attending the conference on the 100 Years of Communism tomorrow, and you will be the final speaker responding to what has been said, and we're very grateful for that reason. Thirdly, I want to, you are the first deliverer, this doesn't sound quite right, but I think it is, of the Robert Conquest Memorial speech. And this is also the first Danube Institute Prize we are giving. And we're giving it partly as a result of the generosity of Robert Agostinelli, the philanthropist and financier, who some of you will have met when he came to a conference here about a month and six weeks ago, and he has helped to make this possible. So I can't actually hand you, due to the vagaries of the international banking system, I can't actually hand you a big check right here and now, but I will be handing you one as soon as we solve that. But in the meantime, my wife, Melissa, will present you with an...
Lift out the bowl. And if you look on the bottom, and you can read the inscription. So this is made here in Hungary, and it says,
Says the Danube Institute Prize, November the 8th, 2017. Wonderful.
Thank you very much. Robert, thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, I invite all of those who have not already registered to attend our conference tomorrow if you have the time. My wife will tell you have to register to get in, but if you say a word to me, I'll get you through. And now we move on to the entertaining, so to speak, though we were entertained, to the more entertaining section. And I hope you enjoy our dinner, and I look forward to meeting you all on other and similar occasions. I should finally add, there's a group of people here, guests at the Friends of Hungary, from Canada and the United States, from France and one or two other countries. I'd like particularly also to welcome them. I hope they've enjoyed themselves, and I hope we'll have good contacts between the Danube Institute and them in future years. And I've forgotten something, darling. Oh, I'm sorry, of course. I should finally have said, we have some extraordinarily gifted young Hungarian people who work for the Institute and who do a lot of dog's body work for which they are much too intelligent, but fortunately they are hard-working and they are prepared to do it. And we're very grateful to them because we found among young Hungarians a degree of application, ingenuity, intelligence and public spirit that really speaks very well for the future of this country. And so I'd like, why don't you stand up, boys and girls? Just boys now. Sorry. Yes. And thank you very much indeed. Enjoy your dinner, and as I shall certainly do. Robert, again, thanks.